Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Hall, and I'm the moderator for today's Meet a Poet series. I'm a poet myself. I'm from Washington, D.C., but right now I'm calling in from Philadelphia, where I currently study creative writing at UPenn. And I'm delighted to introduce this month's poet, who writes with both gusto and grace. Please give it up for Tracy Youngblom. Tracy Youngblom earned an MA in English from the University of St. Thomas and an MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson College low-residency program. She has been writing and publishing poems since the early 1990s. She has published 2 chapbooks of poems, Driving to Heaven and One Bird a Day, as well as 2 full-length collections, Growing Big and The Recent Boy. Her awards and honors include 2 Pushcart nominations, including one in 2017 for a poem from Boy. In addition to poems, her memoir, Because We Must, won the Juniper Prize for Creative Nonfiction and will be published by the University of Massachusetts Press in March 2025. Thank you, Tracy, for joining us today. I'm so excited to hear your poems aloud. And just as an FYI, after the reading, we will have a brief Q&A session, so feel free to put your questions in the chat. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tracy.
Hello, I am delighted to be here and delighted to be able to share some of my poems with you. The first poems I'm going to read are poems that focus on a subject that is really dear to me, which is my children. So these are very personal poems. Since the time my children were little, I've been writing about them. They seem to not mind. But this group of poems is from when they were a little bit older. And these are all from a manuscript that has yet to be published. So the first poem is called The Funeral. When the crayfish dies, it's a relief. Not another hamster or bird, creatures we'd spoken to in our loneliness. Just this slice of armored flesh, paled to gray and mottled, claws limp as wilted corsages, crenellated tail tucked, harmless. We hold it without fear in death. My boys will bury it under tomatoes, cutting through spotted light. Even in heat, they smile, leaning on their shovels, singing songs they've prepared for its passing. His passing, this one they've named Champ. Working together for once, they manage the ceremony without a single fight, raise their eyes to the sky in studious reverence, except the smallest, who fixes his gaze on the ground, pretend to wipe a few tears. Not sadness, but performance. They talk to see themselves talking, this circle of boys with its broken circumference. One hanging back, indifferent, moving to show movement, gestures I recognize and want to applaud, do applaud, and send them off with their spent solemnity. Later, I find the youngest, my sweet son, wrapped in himself, leaning on a corner of the garage, crying so hard I can barely touch him. Wrenched from contentment, I should have known how he'd feel, this child who remembers his birth, who can't bear, years later, the sad truth of divorce. I hold his bare shoulders, ruffle and smooth his hair, try to speak, try to make him speak, tease out his grief for this animal, sharp and suspicious, not even his. He can't hear me. He's out of reach. It's true. I have taught them all to stand in the light their own words make, to make up their worlds as they go. And now, silence. This one wants no words, nothing from me, just his sorrow. So I have three children, and they're all boys. And so we had a very crazy, wild life when they were all teenagers. But this next poem is a poem about kind of a sweet moment during that time. It is called His 13th Spring. This is the child who once asked me where heaven is. Not approximately, but precisely. Above us, or intermingled with the vaporous clouds, or some other named place? He bends down to talk now, avoids my eyes, wearing those heavy shoes he needed, wondering if I want to play tennis on the driveway, since it's not yet dark. Sky reaches down, blue circle burning indigo, released heat rising around our wet feet. Birds flare from tree to bush, become shadow and hum as we lob the ball back and forth. It arcs in brief illumination toward our hidden faces. I'm pretty bad at this, I say. You just need a little encouragement, he says. Our echoing steps. Here it is, he says. Here. This next poem is actually a sonnet, which is a very formal, rhymed poem, and it was really fun to try to write it. It's about my middle son who played football for a while. He was very small and scrawny for his age, so he was on a team with a bunch of boys who were a lot younger than him. And it was a kind of a horror and a delight to watch him get into this game. So this sonnet is called Nate Learns the Game. On the line, it shows. No one's ever taught him to play. Small, folded, frog-like, he squats, knees affixed to elbows with his sweat. 2 years older than these boys, he forgets his age. Their welcome shows in bruises, dappling his slender arms. The uses of the body. Head down, he takes his flight. His hands fly up as if to shun the light or clear a watery way. A quick dip, a stutter step, a turn. His darts and checks make helmets shift. He breaks through, just a slip of a kid. Mine, who rushes to attack. Grab and hold, flesh or uniform. Bring down bones, boys. Raise muffled thuds, sodden ground. I did write that poem some years ago, and my creative writing advisor at the time said that there weren't enough sonnets about boys playing football, so I took that as a very great compliment. Okay, so this next poem is the last one I'm going to read about my children, and it's kind of just a little bit of a reflection on what it's like to raise boys and have them eventually grow up in a way which they're supposed to do, but which is also kind of painful. It's called What No One Tells You. Their lips form the soft O's of hunger, even in sleep. They pout involuntarily, no reason for self-doubt. Some cries are just for attention, not alarm. They will drool, souring fabric and hugs for years. Breast milk looks thin, but it's thick enough to dry in stiff circles on all your shirts. They will refuse the breasts eventually. You may be ready, maybe not. They will interrupt you in the bathroom and in profound sleep. They will run and scream down grocery aisles to make sure you are paying attention. They will eat voraciously, scattering rice grains on the floor like sticky pearls. They will lie to you, grinning. They will not be satisfied until they have eaten through your pantry and your heart, and even then, you will still want more. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of poems on a very, very different subject now. Probably next to my children, the subject that I have explored the most in poetry, which is poems about my father. I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s when divorce was very rare, but my parents did eventually divorce, partly because my father was an alcoholic and an abusive person and, had a series of affairs, which often happens when people are alcoholic and abusers. So and my father died in 2000, so he's been gone a long time. So I feel like after he died, then I had some permission to explore some of the complexities of the relationship that I had with him. So again, this next group of poems focuses on my father. This poem is called I Think My Father. I think my father had a heart. He wore it outside his shirt sometimes, and sometimes it slept in his chest. Now I hear it's failed him. Poor heart, stumped to beat. He can't work or walk to the mailbox. They strapped him to a table and grabbed one of his veins to try to rope it. His body said, "No, no, I won't be tied together by my own twine." I think he refused to speak. Oh, he's a big, two-hearted man. He always won the women who couldn't help it. There it was, misplaced heart, all wet and waiting to be touched. Except my mother kept pushing it back inside, not to hide it, but so she could rock it to sleep. Hear it sing to her a word only she could understand. Only she could not understand, since its speech was slurred. It sloshed and burped at her. Old dry heart. Now it croaks in its case and stays put. How long it'll last, or how quickly I'll race to its final thump, I can't say. Maybe I'll fly there on the first arrhythmic shout to see if it's true. It will leap out of his parted gown into my cupped, expectant hand. It would be fine to see it. I could forgive the mess on the bed for such an end because I think my father had a heart he wants me to have. Okay. And this next poem, still about my father, is a little bit longer and a little bit more dense. It is called Animal Thoughts. In twilight, shooting at anything that moves or doesn't, at turtles, heads like small-nosed rockets just above the pond's surface. My father's hand points and the sun is slipping below the horizon. My father's hand is the horizon. The sun sinks like my mother's face when I tell her. At the sink, she will turn slowly and stare, light leaving her, replaced with an ominous cloud. Clouds are nowhere to be seen. The horizon at the end of my father's hand is years away. My vision clouds because I must close one eye to shoot. The sound of the gun coincides with the first appearance of stars. In near darkness, water ceases to reflect. I can see the heads I intend to hit, dark points rising. The stars pop like the gun and the water pops, disrupted when I miss. I miss often. My father's laughter tells me when I miss. My mother must think I'm a good shot or that I was shooting at people. Her vision darkens like the air as it becomes night. Your grandfather, she says. What would he say if he knew? But he is dead. Death came and took him who first put a gun in my hand, told me to shoot at tin cans balanced on fence posts. How can missing him still matter? Now I have to go back and retract my finger from the trigger of the gun at the shore while twilight descends. Refuse the gun, my father's suggestion. How else could I have attended his funeral and wept? How otherwise can I have thought it fun, following my father's hand toward the horizon, the animal thoughts of those turtles just up for breath? It stopped being light, but it took too long. My father's arm kept raising, and my thoughts were somewhere else. The horizon, the dimming sky, the plop of bullets ruffling the water's surface. His laughter rang in my ear. When I stopped shooting, it continued. He was invisible, just a voice without a body. Earlier, his hand had raised, and I had let my eyes slide along his sleeve until they rested on what looked like rocks rising out of the water. I never thought they were rocks. I saw the horizon and the turtles' heads, and I forgot myself. When I told my mother, I wanted to run back in time and shake my own head to clear it. I never told anyone else. It got dark too late that day. The light made my eyes strain. The challenge of it made me clench. My father's hand on the horizon, guiding me. His voice tempting. Bet you can't hit them. Time rushed by like a storm. It keeps up its noise. Its vicious kick never goes away, nor the ache in my shoulder, or my body reeling backwards. So this is another poem about my father. And what I tell people about this poem is that I don't think it's literally true. I don't think it's literally true. I have some memories that coincide with some things that happen in here. I'm not sure if it happened just the way it's written, but I also think this is one of the truest poems that I ever wrote about my father. It's called Fishing with My Father, St. Croix River. A boat of his own making, no poles, no fish in sight, just his voice, lip curling like a worm, and pure imagination. A story for each of the Rapalas we don't have, which exist in his gestures, tilting to catch the sun's glint, toss it up to where it tips the frayed end of rope hanging from a limb above our heads. A cow's tail, a compass to circle us, this river mumbling by, and a beer, nestled in sand at his right hip, hidden, it is agreed, behind his bent leg. When he sips, I hear the sound his throat makes, water lapping the half-moon rubber toes of my shoes. He doesn't have to tell me not to watch bottles accrue. After a while, he doesn't speak to me, but casts his voice over the gliding waters. I know passing time from what floats by, capsized minnow buckets, Shasta cans half sunk, logs so soaked with the St. Croix's wisdom they coast, submerged, part of its mind. Lifted sometimes, gripping the rope above the place it ravels, I swing out over the river that swirls and gurgles below. The shore disappears as I twirl with the ropes unwinding, spins back to face my father, who grows larger as I race to his form. I say, I wasn't afraid, so we will come again. We come again to the old Impala where I will sleep on the drive, unaware that I will dream of cruel mysteries. Dream, even now, of the hunger that makes one hang on when it feels like death, which must be a kind of love, one that shows up with a swagger, a few memorable words, a distance to enforce. And one more poem on the surface. On the surface, perhaps not about my father, but underneath, very much about my father. It is called A Witness. Christ, it'll break your heart. These black ants, armored for survival, swarm the beetle's body, to the eye more alive than dead. It rocks, its lacquered green shell sliding open to reveal gold, still lit from within. It could be dancing, or crawling, or hauled. It proceeds, animate. The frantic ants punch it, their dusty feet raising a dry scuffling that intensifies like singing, while its guts flood their open mouths. And now they trudge on, fed. But look, they've bled it, and still it glows, twitching. Is there wind? Toward the sun, made radiant. It's meant to last. Time yet before it dries to a hollow, appears inedible. Never believe it. It will feed something. The ground, the mind, become a shrine, not food, but illusion. Its body to embody, glinting, it beckons, it taunts, as the dead seem to do, whatever the living want. Okay, so take a little break from some of the intensity of those poems to tell a little story before I read a few more poems. So everything that I just read, I think I said, is from an unpublished manuscript, a manuscript of poems that I've been trying to get published for a long time. And one time I wanted some feedback, so I actually hired somebody to give me some feedback on the manuscript and paid them money. And what that person said was basically that none of the poems were finished and that the manuscript as a whole wasn't really a book. So I did not write after that for 6 months, and I struggled to even wonder if I was a writer at all. Even though I had published a couple of books already, I thought, well, maybe this person's right. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe I'm not a poet. So I needed to give myself something to do to get back into writing after about 6 months. So what I decided to do was this. When I look out the window in my kitchen, there's some bird feeders hanging. So I thought to myself, well, I'll just stand at the kitchen window and look out as I do anyway every morning while I'm drinking my coffee. And I'll just see what I observe. And then I'll write one tiny poem a day about what I see out my window. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be any good. But just to see if I could still write any poems at all whatsoever. So eventually those poems did turn into something. They turned into a book that I published called One Bird a Day. So I'm going to read a few of those poems to you. The way that the book eventually ended up was that it it kind of goes through the cycle of a year, starting in October, just before winter comes here in my part of the world, and then ending the next year right before winter comes again. So the poems have titles and they have dates. So that's what you'll hear. You hear the title and the date of when I actually wrote that poem. So the book is called One Bird a Day. And the first poem is Birds Against First Snow, November 10th. So furiously they hammer, beaks puncturing miniature drifts, hulls littering new snow, natural order reversed. Bottom becomes the top, crown of rubble. And why not? Thickest nights approach, march in with their certainty, compressing light to a manageable slab. These birds alone refusing to yield. And this poem is Balance, November 11th. Feeder swings back and forth in wind, sensor dispensing food for the stomach, not the soul. And a pair of birds, finch and sparrow, ride easily as they eat. Cloud of hulls dispersed in air, spun to dust on the ground. When one bird rises and flies, the negligible weight of the remaining sparrow tilts the feeder askew. When I started writing these poems, as I said, I was writing out of a period of very intense doubt about whether I was a writer at all. And I don't know if that's the only reason, but for that reason, these poems were quite different, as you can probably tell from the earlier poems that I had written. They were shorter. They were less about me personally. They were more measured. So I just thought that was also an interesting thing for me out of this period of, as I said, really intense doubt. My voice as a poet expanded. So this is a poem called In and Out, January 5th. Two chickadees burn a path through air from the feeder suspended on its frozen pole, cloaked in shade, to the bare twigs of dogwood, doused with sun. Back and forth, taking turns. Or is there just one bird tethered to hunger, plunging each time into darkness, then winging back to light, where it cracks and chews and prepares for the next descent? This year that I was writing these poems happened to be a just terrifically cold and snowy winter here, and these poems, the winter ones especially, reflect that. This is What We All, January 20th. Snow under feeders so deep it almost cradles their bases. To fill them I suit up, sorrel, coat, gloves, suffer snow cascading over the highest islet. Today, no birds in sight, but tracing a path across the surface of snow, tracks, delicate trail. Sparrow patterning this canvas with its feet, perhaps never to see these impressions, fleeting legacy. What we all long for, one glimpse of the possible beauty we leave behind. This is Dark Birds, White World, February 20. The ground is strewn with remnants of a feast. Seed hulls and chaff darken, flatten snow under feeders where a pair of juncos hop and glean, while above them sparrows the color of river water and nuthatches grayed by morning light ride the conveyor of hunger to the feeder and back. Slant of early sunlight ricochets off snow, blinds me, so I don't know if the streak of red I sense rather than see out of my left eye is a cardinal scouting for a chance to feed alone, or a simple reminder that the world is torn even in its beauty and bleeds. And this last poem I'm going to read from that book is much later in the cycle. It's Toad in the Grass, August 10th. Yesterday, as I mowed the overgrown lawn, I alerted what hides in long grass. Small toads with pebbled backs, hopping their scalloped way out of my way to the shade of hosta or lily of the valley. But here's one lone toad with a pecked back under the front yard feeders, caught in the motion of escape. A bird, maybe crow or grackle, just missing a snack, leaving a mark that says, I'll be back. In awe, in surrender, I touched the bump of its red innards brought forth. The ways of the lords of earth are not inscrutable. Okay. I just have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to read one poem from my newest book of poems. The book is called Boy, and that boy mostly stands for my brother, who died when he was a child. He was the youngest of the four of us, three girls and then him. And he died suddenly from an accident, from a fall down the stairs in our home. So the poems in the book are a sequence. They are meant to be read in order. And I just kind of explore what that was like for us as kids and that long and short-term aftermath of such a tragic death in our family. And so I will just read the first poem in the book, which is a prologue poem, and it just kind of introduces the story and kind of all the ideas. And it's just called Prologue. Imagine a mirror dropped and shattered, a certain beauty in the fragmented, mosaicked wreckage. It appears arranged, purposeful, artfully confusing. That is illusion. Nothing fits together. There is no surface, just images lifted and hurled against each other. That's how it is with fractured memory, the past. Not to mention the bad luck it is to enter. It's like a crime syndicate. Even casual involvement will cost you your innocence. I didn't break the mirror. I wouldn't choose to rummage. My face is hidden, even from myself. You can cut yourself open or see something that is not there, trying to retrieve or repair. Maybe a cobbled version of that boy's life will emerge if I crawl long enough, mustering the faith of the doubtful. So thank you for listening to my poems.
Thank you, Tracy, for walking us through your work and taking us through the different themes and sharing with us from Boy and A Bird a Day. I have some questions prepared, but I would encourage everyone watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Just wow, Tracy, it was amazing to hear you read your work. It's one thing to see the poems on the page, but it's another thing entirely to have the poet themselves read them. So it was truly a privilege and a gift to have you here. Um, I, really, I really loved how you were reading from one word a day, and I noticed that throughout all of your poems, animals frequently appear, from beetles, ants, fish, turtles, crayfish, and you render them with such a delicate care. So I was curious, how did you first develop this intimate relationship with nature, and how does it shape your poetic practice?
Um, I really think that comes from my earliest childhood memories. My grandparents, my mom's parents, had a farm, a dairy farm. So they had cows and chickens and ducks and geese, and there were always cats and dogs around everywhere. And we spent a lot of time there when I was growing up helping on the farm. And so I was just surrounded by a world that was the natural world, right? I mean, we just the animals were always a part of our life. So I know I didn't read any poems about. I do have a poem called "The Poem About Cows," but I just and it was my grandfather, I think, who was just a wonderful man who just had a reverence for all life and who named all of his cows and treated them like they were individual personalities. And so I just that was just natural to me to pay attention and to try to see animals as part of our world and not separate from it.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Um, And from your bio, it says that you've been writing poetry or just writing period since the 1990s. And we were able to see a snippet of, I'm sure, what is a very broad body of work. I am a poet myself, and I've been writing seriously since I was 14. I'm 19 now, and so that's only been 5 years. I've already seen how much my writing has evolved. So I was curious about how has your writing thematically or just your writing process evolved over the past almost 4 decades of writing?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying a little bit more about what I already said. After the first two books, when I had that spell where I thought, "Oh man, I'm not a writer. I've been fooling myself," that called for a change. And so, the first two books, the chapbook and my first collection called "Growing Big," were all purely personal poems modeled on my life. So I guess maybe what you'd call confessional or that school of poetry, and that was great because life, I think, provides lots and lots and lots of fodder for considering the significance. But as I grew older and then as I saw a need to change, I started looking outward a little bit. And so One Bird a Day was really focused on. And then I know you couldn't see it stylistically, but on the page those poems look very different. They're shorter lines, they're sparer. They're less personal, even though they certainly came from my observations. I wanted to keep myself as a speaker a little bit less visible in those poems. And then, I think another major difference is the first two books were more thematically, like I was writing about subjects, parenting, raising children, divorcing. And then the most recent two books, One Bird a Day and Boy, they were definite projects. Like I set myself a goal. Here, I'm going to look out my front window and, see how many poems I can write. And then when I started writing poems for the book Boy, I wasn't even sure that I remembered enough, but I just thought, okay, I'm just gonna just start writing poems about what I remember from my childhood. So I had a much more definite goal to try to explore a topic in writing, which was not happening when I was younger. I was just sort of writing on the fly all the time. So it's a different kind. I think also a different kind of energy, like maybe a more thoughtful or focused energy that I have written with in the latter half of my writing life.
It's interesting that you bring up your doubt for when you first started writing Boy? You're like, oh, I'm not sure if I remember everything from my childhood. And during the reading, when you were talking about fishing with my father, St. Croix River, you said, this might not be necessarily true, but it's the truest version of my father and this memory in this moment. I think when you're writing poetry, a lot of my personal experience with writing is taking an image from one moment in time and inserting it into another moment just to connect those two images together. And that's just the power of using metaphor and figurative language. So I think regardless of whether it was necessarily true, it still has a lot of impact.
Yeah, I think that I think that is true of many of the poems in Boy, because you know how memory works too. Um, my sisters and I, we were all there. We all experienced the same series of events, and yet we remember them very differently. So I would have to say that about those poems. They're true in my mind and in my memory, but I mean, it made me think now, is memory true? I mean, memory, is it literally true? I don't always think it is. I mean, so you can only write from your own perspective of these are the impressions I have, and everybody else has different impressions. So I think, yeah, I'm not always trying to capture truth with a capital T, just emotional truth maybe, or is a good synonym.
And when you write the poem about your impression, it can spark the conversation between you and your sisters about their version of events. And then together, maybe you can weave together the true facts of the situation.
Yeah.
And memory changes things, grief changes things. A lot of your poems revolve around grief. And I'm curious how your grieving process has intertwined itself with the process of writing poetry.
Yeah. Well, definitely when I wrote the poems from Boy, I was purposely calling up a grief from my childhood. A grief, for our whole family. I mean, losing a sibling, for my mother, losing a child was a really significant loss. But what I discovered was that grief maybe never totally goes away, because it wasn't the same sharp grief, but when you think back on these events that shaped your life, I felt this new or different kind of sadness. I mean, there were many times when I was trying to write poems for that book where I would just be sitting typing and crying, because it was everything. It was how long it had been, and I was remembering this really, difficult thing from my childhood, and really how you just have to move on. Like, you have to move on, and that's also a kind of grief, right? You can't bring the person back, but to keep moving forward with your life is a challenge too. So I think it was, especially in that, grief was very much a part of my writing process. And so I'll say one more thing, because you talked about putting two images together. In the poems that are in Boy, I usually did start with just one specific thing that I remembered, maybe a little visual memory, or maybe a little thing that somebody said, and then that's what would start the poem.
So sorry.
That's okay.
Connection. Sorry, we were talking about the two images.
Oh, yeah. So I'll repeat that. So you talked about how you like to just put two images next to each other, as part of the process of creating. And when I was writing the poems for the book Boy, I almost always started with one really specific visual image that I had, or maybe something that somebody said. So I started from that one little piece that I remembered, and then built the poem from there. And then, I mean, that's where the whole question of truth comes in. I built the poems, I constructed them. So there's something true in each of them, but I'm also 40 years later, kind of trying to make sense of something.
And the prologue that you read talked about the broken mirror, and I recently was rereading The Snow Queen, Hans Christian Andersen, is all about the Demon King. I don't know if you're familiar, but the Goblin King has his mirror, and he drops it, and it shatters. And when the fragment of the shard of the mirror enters the little boy Kai's eye, suddenly his perception of things becomes warped. He sees everything that's good in the world as evil, and vice versa. So it's interesting how this book about memory and remembering things and recalling grief and conversations from so long ago also has the metaphor of a warped mirror.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a great metaphor. Yeah. And how something can change your vision, can literally change your vision. Yeah.
And I'm sure when you lost your brother, it completely shifted your perception of life itself. It was probably a life-altering moment.
Yeah, and of family. I mean, even though our family survived intact, but still it's different, it's different. There's this hole that never can be refilled. Yeah.
You talked about how the poems in One Bird a Day are structured. I saw in the packet that they're structured in couplet form and very sparse. And then in your other poems, like What No One Tells You, you have the 3 lines per stanza followed by the final standalone line, which perfectly mirrors the pacing and emphasis of the poem. And then you also have the sonnet form in Nate Learns the Game, which was so funny and so creative. I really enjoyed reading that one. I just wonder, what's your relationship between content and form? How do you decide what form the poem should take?
That's such a great question. I think earlier, my earlier work, I was sort of just copying what I saw in the poems that I read. And so, like, I would write in the chunky stanzas. I think, that's what I was exposed to at the time. So I wasn't probably thinking that much about form earlier when I was writing. But I do think starting around One Bird a Day, and by that time I had been reading I've been reading poems for 20 or 30 years. You see what the possibilities are. And what I learned about the couplet form was that it does help you with the pacing of a poem. Like, you can release information a little at a time, so it slows everything down. And also, I think I became able to condense more, and make more leaps, instead of explaining everything. So, and then honestly, when I was writing the poems that became the book boy, I use a lot of couplets, not all, but a lot of couplets, because it was so hard to write those poems that I just felt like I needed just 2 lines. I'm gonna take a break. Okay, now I can write 2 more lines, and I needed to let it out like that carefully and that deliberately. And then once I will say, on top of everything else, once I have something written, then I can play with the form. It's fun to move things around and try different. How does it look on the page? So the final form is kind of a combination of what I felt instinctively, and then take a little distance from it and look again and see if that's the best way to align them on the page.
Cool. The way you broke the lines for some of the bird poems was also really fun. Like when you talked about, I think it was in January, February, how you were donning your gloves, and then you also said suffer snow, and it was like you were putting on suffering, and I thought that was super cool.
Thank you. I have always enjoyed choosing where the line breaks are to offer a little surprise or a little, tension to readers. So I'm glad that sometimes it works.
You mentioned how when you have the actual content of the poem, you'll start playing around with form. Could you tell us a little bit more about your revision process and how do you know when a poem is finished and you won't touch it anymore?
Yeah. My revision process. So my writing process is I'm a very linear, orderly person. So if I'm writing a poem, I try to get a first draft down from beginning to end, however long that takes. Like I don't like to start and then go away and then come back on the draft. And then, so when I start to revise, honestly, I usually ask someone else to give me some feedback. Like a part of my revision process is always, what do you think of this? And so I take people's impressions of a poem and try to use them. But, first round of revisions, I always go through and cut out language that seems excess, Like in a first draft, I just literally want to get it all on paper. I don't want to censor myself. I don't want to do anything. So then it's neatening it up, like getting rid of the excess. And then I start to look for what we were just talking about. I start to look for sound echoes and other kind of echoes where I could leave something at the end of a line that would carry sound through the poem or carry meaning or idea through the poem. And I would say after I kind of get those two things going on, then that's where that's more work for me because I don't like to delete things that I've written, right? And sometimes being ruthless with your own poems is really hard. But then the play starts where I do like just move things around, try different stanza lengths, just break the lines at all different places. So as far as when a poem is done, I think I just try multiple versions and then I settle on one that I like the best. That seems closest to what I was trying to achieve. And then honestly, then I ask for more readers and more feedback, like at least twice in the process. Hey, what do you think of now? I have one really good friend that I got my master's in English with, and we trade work. We read everything that the other person has written. So I have a really good, faithful person who's not afraid to tell me the truth. And then who would see versions of a poem and give me feedback. So that's kind of in a nutshell the process.
I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that you have a community around you and that poetry isn't just a solitary act for you. Like right now, this program is happening because poetry demands to be read aloud and have a conversation around it. And there are some poets like Emily Dickinson who never intended to have an audience, but because she does, and because we have Emily Dickinson's poetry, we are all the better for it. And because we have your poetry and we're having a conversation about it, I feel enriched. And I'm sure everyone else feels enriched too.
Well, thank you. Yeah, poems are, because they're related to music, so they are meant to be heard. And I guess I can add that to my answer to your previous question. A final test to see if a poem has reached its ideal form is to read it out loud to somebody. I don't often read out loud to myself, but trying out poems in public and then asking people afterwards, because it matters how it strikes the audience too. It's that idea of, even though I think I've expressed something, maybe I haven't got it quite right. So then, that's what the community is for, to help each other figure out where there's something that could be a little better or clearer.
Awesome. Well, I think that our time today is drawing to an end. Is there anything else you would like to say, maybe about your upcoming book or anything else you'd like to share, Tracy?
Sure, I appreciate that. So I have published 4 books of poems, 2 chapbooks and 2 full-length collections. But I had been working on a memoir, and because we were talking about grief and subjects, 10 years ago now, in March, my youngest son, who was in his early 20s, was hit by a drunk driver, nearly head on, because the driver was going the wrong way. And because of that accident, 3 weeks into his recovery, we discovered that he had lost his eyesight. He's completely blind. And so all of our lives turned into something different at that point. And so not right away after the accident, but I did start writing about that. And eventually I wrote this memoir story about his recovery and my recovery as his mother. So it's titled Because We Must, and I feel, I'm very lucky because it won the Juniper Prize for Creative Nonfiction and is going to be published by the University of Massachusetts Press. I just feel really lucky that sometimes you just submit the work to the right, at the right time and the right place to the right person. I'm very grateful to the judge for seeing the merit in it. So that memoir, which is prose, will be coming out in about 2 months.
Wow. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that story, and I'm really looking forward to its publication. Congratulations, Tracy.
Thank you so much.
Uh, Thank you, everyone, for being in attendance. A round of applause for Tracy. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks.